What up, world? It's Fess with Reverb back here in the studio, and today I want to talk about 5 elements that I use to make drum sample packs sound more original. Today I want to talk about making sample packs sound original. Have you ever downloaded a sample pack and just tried to insert it in the beats that you're making and weren't really happy with the results? Well, there's about 5 elements that I use to make those samples sound more like what I want them to sound. And that is sample selection, pitch and tuning, or pitch shifting, depending on what you're trying to do, filtering and EQing, which is a really important thing that can dramatically change the harmonics of your samples, delay-based effects like reverb and echo and delay, of course, and finally dynamics like compression, distortion, and saturation. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so today I'm working on the MPC, and I want to preface this by saying that just because I'm working on the MPC live doesn't mean you have to go out and get the MPC. All of these same principles apply to virtually any piece of sampling hardware or any DAW or any software that you're working with where you can load up samples. All of these principles apply. We're here in 2020. There is not a sampler out there that doesn't offer elements of some of the effects that I'm talking about today. So keep that in mind. Just because I'm doing it on MPC doesn't mean you can't do it in Ableton or in Logic or on your iPad using Koala Sampler or whatever. And I am actually going to be working with the Reverb Legacy Drum Machine collection, which you could actually find on reverb.com for free. And it's like about 7 gigs of all of these drum machines and all of the samples, and they even have Ableton project files in there if you're working with Ableton, so you could just load them right up in the Ableton drum rack. But today I'm just actually going to be working with the hard audio files. All right, so now I kind of selected the samples I want to work with. I kind of picked like a mixed bag from that Reverb drum machine collection. So I'm working with like a CR78 kick and a snare and like a Lendrum shaker and like a Korg Rhythm 55 woodblock, another CR78, and then like a TR-808 hi-hat. I love to do this type of stuff when I'm faced with a lot of drum samples. I don't like to just, stick to only 808 sounds or only CR78 sounds. I like to mix it up, especially if I'm working with other grooves or just other samples. Sometimes I even let those grooves ride and then I select, my main kick and my main snare. Selecting those right 2 samples alone, again, it's like 80 to 90% of the job is just selecting the right samples to use with whatever you're doing. So with this kick right here, this is the Roland CR78 kick. It sounds kind of like right for what I'm wanting to do. Let's get the full level going. This snare sounds okay. But what happens when I just start to tune it more appropriately? Let's go back to a program that I already got set up here. That's the same kick, but I detuned it by about 2 semitones. Same snare, I detuned that by about 1 semitone. This is the Lendrum Kabasa, actually. I actually uptuned that about 4 semitones. And the Korg Rhythm 55, I uptuned that about 2 semitones. So again, hear the difference. See, it's like half the battle, guys, is just knowing where you want to go and just getting it there. And, more times than not, unless you're dealing with like a music production nerd, nobody out there is going to be guessing like, hey, you used the CR78 kick and you detuned it or whatever. Don't worry about all that noise. Make the drums sound like you. When you hear beat makers say that we want to hear your drums, not drums or presets from like whatever other machines, this is what they mean. Spicing it up and making it fit to whatever you're working with. All right, so now that I got those drums sort of tuned the way I want to go, I built a little groove here just to kind of get things going. But it's still sounding a little bit stagnant to me. So what I'm going to do is go in and start EQing and filtering these drums, mainly filtering, kind of like cutting out frequencies that I don't want and kind of harmonically shaping the samples the way that I want them. In the MPC, it's best to do that in Program Edit and go over to Filter and Envelope, and bam, you got a lot of filters to work with. This is one of the cool things about the MPC, especially the newer ones. I know I'm being biased, but hey, it's all jam-packed in there. Not to mention, you have touchscreen over your filter envelope and like your cutoff and whatnot. So it just makes things really easier. And keep in mind, if you're working in like an MPC or let's say like a Roland sampler or like a SP404, any other piece of hardware, keep in mind that the more you do in that hardware, the less you have to do in post-production. And that's what makes hardware cool. You could do a lot without having to sit in front of a DAW and try to do what you really wanted to do, if that makes any sense. Now I'm gonna move on and actually filter some of these drums to just bring out more harmonic character. I put on a high pass filter on the snare where, you know, when it's not there, it does sound a little bit more beefier, but for this particular composition, I kind of want to just have it only the highs coming through. Let's do a 4-band high pass filter and set my cutoff a little bit low so it's not cutting off too much of the meat there on the low end. And if you play with the resonance as well, it can get a little nasally, so I don't really do that. I kind of leave the resonance always low, especially with drums, because I don't like nasally sounding drums if I'm gonna add some filters to it. And then with the kick, I threw in a low pass filter and just to kind of take some of that high down, and bam, like usually, you know, people will be able to like spot kicks, but just adding one filter, one low pass filter on a kick can be all the difference in making your kick indistinguishable from the next man's kick or whoever. If you listen to what I got here, this is with my drums actually filtered, and this is with my drums not filtered. Go to filtered. Unfiltered. Either way, it kind of works, but to me, I'm kind of riding with the filtering because I know that it's where I want to go harmonically. And you can keep going further than that. But the key thing to remember is with filtering, you don't want to obviously cut off your sound too much to where, you know, you're not really hearing it. So be real light and subtle with it. But sometimes light and subtle, or what they call subtractive EQing, is all what you need to sort of make the drums fit better and just, you know, not overwhelm your groove or whatever. So let's move on. What I like to do after kind of tuning and filtering my drums, I like to play with delay-based effects. I know a lot of producers that kind of stray away from putting delay-based effects on their drums, but more times than not, I'm always using a delay on something, either the hi-hat, which is what I usually do. First, I like to make my hi-hats have a wider stereo field, so I always kind of put a stereo widener on my hi-hats just because they just sound good to me. And again, I like to put a delay on my hi-hats as well, just to kind of like make it sound more rhythmically loose. And also, I like to play with the velocity of my hi-hat hits to make them sound more human instead of just sounding strictly robotic with the same quantized type hits and like the same volume. Certain beats can fit well, but for the most part, when you're making sample-based hip hop or sample-based electronic music, it's best to kind of humanize your hi-hats. That's just a Fess tip for you. So, as you can hear, I just kind of changed this whole groove by just adding that delay. There it is with no delay. Sounds cool, but just throwing on a subtle bit of delay with just a little bit of feedback can be like all the difference you need in a groove. There's no feedback, which is basically like no delay, but just a little bit. And that sounds cool to me. So let's go back, unsolo this. When you're working with delay-based effects, the general rule of thumb is to always sort of use a return track or, bus certain samples together and then send that to a return track. That is definitely still a rule, but to me, that's more of a post-production rule, especially when you're working with one piece of hardware like the MPC. The MPC has return tracks. I can take this sample, send it over to a return track, and maybe dial in another sample with that on the same return track. But in this case, I only want the hi-hat to have this delay on it. And I'm using this delay as like an additional instrument to add more rhythm to this groove. So I'm not really worrying about, the processing power for just this one delay sample or one hi-hat sample per se. But do keep in mind that if you are mixing a lot of drums, try working with return tracks on delay-based effects because it could just be a lot less processing power on whatever you're using, especially if you're using a computer or whatnot. I really kind of like where this is going, especially when I add this sample to it. So now that I got this groove going, I got a sample loop going, I got a few drums that I have tuned right and I've filtered the way I wanted to, and I've even added a delay to the hi-hat to just kind of spice it up. Now I want to add some dynamics to sort of glue all these drums together. And I'm basically going to just use a basic compressor. The thing about dynamics though is they could be, we could spend all day talking about this, but one of the key things to remember when you're using a compressor on drum samples is to definitely use compression over just using a compressor on like a single sample. So I would stray away from using a compressor on just a snare or just the kick, unless I was really trying to, use the kick to sort of act as a side chain to another part of the groove. But again, that's a whole nother conversation. So we're not gonna get into that. It could just help your drums sound a lot more glued together and just fit together and make it so not one particular drum hit is like drowning out, your hi-hat over here or like your shaker over there. Let's solo these drums. If you hear right now, it's kind of like all over the place. And that's fine, but since I have a compressor in this MPC, why not use it? Here's this groove with the compressor off. I got a real low threshold set. Could always go lower, but I kind of like it where it's at. And that's kind of like where I want to be. I mean, I can turn this down with the dry wet knob just so you can hear the difference. But I kind of like it as is. A real quick attack, real medium type release. And these samples are so good, I don't really need to do any like makeup gain with this compression. So I'll throw that all back in the groove and it fits. So another part of working with dynamics, not just compression, not just saturation, but also distortion. And distortion can really help bring out a little bit more character in your samples, but it is very easy to overuse. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I like to use distortion on my kicks, just to, again, bring out a little bit more character and grit. But what happens when you use too much? Which is very possible. Here I'm working with a preset. And again, don't be afraid to work with presets. The people who made this hardware, they're beat makers like you and I. They sat down and thought about a lot of the technical aspects that we might not even be able to think about when we're, trying to create and trying to write music. So to me, preset settings on especially dynamic effects or any effect for that matter, they're great starting points, and you could trust the presets, but you could also trust your ears to sort of shape the presets the way your ears see fit. So that's what I'm gonna do with this fat bass drum and this distortion effect that I got going for my bass or kick drum. Right now I got the drive set at about 3 dB, and to me, that's like all I need. But I could easily add a little bit more, and it just starts to really change it. So again, start small with almost every element that I'm talking about here. Don't go too hog wild, because unless that's what you want to do. If you want to go hog wild and make super distorted drums, that might be cool to some people. But for what I'm doing right now, I know it doesn't really work. However, I do kind of like that just a little bit of drive made that kick stick out even more. Let's bring the sample back in. And just for overall reference, let's go back with the same sample loop that I'm working with and go back to all of the dry drums that I started with, just so you could hear how doing all of those, adding all of those elements that I was just talking about, how that just made this groove just all the better. Here's everything wet, tuned, and full of effects. And here's everything dry. Sort of works, but not compared to this. And that's the point of using the elements that I spoke about to sort of shape sample packs. There are lots of sample packs out there. Some of them already come tuned and already come ran through certain outboard compressors and saturators and whatnot. And a lot of times those are the appeal with buying the sample pack in the first place. Say for instance, you don't have access to high level studio grade rack gear, and you still want to know what your drums sound like going through an Avalon tube compressor, or what your drums sound like going through like a Lexicon Reverb or whatnot. There are lots of sample packs out there that are made for just that. So be mindful of that when you're searching for sample packs. But also be mindful of what you already have, because chances are that what you're already working with is chock full of effects that work within the elements of what I'm talking about. And that's why I say, just because I'm working on an MPC doesn't mean you can't do this at home with whatever your setup is. So I hope those 5 elements was able to sort of make drum programming easier and make it not as intimidating for a lot of new beat makers out there when they're working with sample packs and they don't want their samples to sound like the next person who downloaded that same sample pack. Feel free to share in the comments what you do in this realm of what I'm talking about, that it might be a little bit different. Maybe I might learn something from you. I like learning as well. I want you guys to keep creating and stay safe. I'm Fess Grandiose, signing off with Reverb. Peace.